We are our second week into the year 2021, and the theme for the year and for the month of January is timeless wisdom and evolutionary vision. And the theme for this particular week is called Grounded Beyond the Beginning, which is that's very curious, isn't it? Um, and so I will get right into uh, one of the quoted themes for this week, and it says the sacred books of all peoples declare that God is one, a unity from which nothing can be excluded, into which nothing can be added, and that is Ernest Holmes' way of what is known throughout the philosophical world as panentheism. Very big, fancy word. It's different than pantheism. So, panentheism posits that God or ultimate reality or the all or the all interpenetrates every part of observable nature and extends beyond it. And that from Wikipedia. But it's a definition that's shared throughout the philosophical community. So that is kind of someone else's definition of what God is, and that's just what it is. It's someone else's idea of God, of spirit. Now, Ernest Holmes often began his radio show with this fairly bold statement that says, and I'm paraphrasing, so hopefully that'll save a lot of emails, but it says there's a force for good in the universe and you can use it. This is how Ernest began many of his radio shows. And there is a corollary to that that says there is a force for good in the universe and it can use you, right? So there is a reciprocal nature to this thing that is a panentheism, that is a theology that is, a definition. I won't call it a belief until it becomes your belief, right? It might be someone else's belief. Um, but and it goes by a lot of different names, and that's one of the things that attracts me to this science of mind teaching, is that we call God a lot of different things. We call it living spirit. We call it the one life. We call it a universal spirit, an infinite intelligence, first cause, the thing itself, and the one infinite reality. This is all great terminology. It's great material for discussion. I have some very dear friends that enjoy getting together for a meal and just discussing what we would call theology, that language that describes God, a being, a greater intelligence or existence or expression or experience. And in that discussion becomes something called ontology, which is the nature of reality, meaning how that theology is playing out in the life of the individual or the life of the collective, right? And none of that in and of itself does anything for me or for anyone else, right? Because it's only to the degree of your consciousness that any of this has any meaning, or any of this has any value, or any of this has any importance in your life or my life, right? And I got to share with you too, it's like the word God, just being with that word for many, many years took a long time for me. It was a word that was supercharged. And I still think about it a lot. And I'm still very compassionate to those who have a charge around the word God, right? And therefore, I encourage you to use the terminology or a terminology that describes something that is powerful and meaningful and deep and intrinsic and true for you, whatever that might be. And it does not have to be the word God. And I'm also going to share with you the part of the charge that I've even discovered recently around the word God. And I hope I'm alone in this, but maybe not. And that is that it elevated God to a standard that I wasn't living up to, right? It was saying, well, there's this big idea, this big concept, and I am not measuring up to it. At least this is the thinking that's playing out in my mind. And therefore, if nothing else, the word God set up a hierarchy, meaning there was something higher, something lower, something up, something down, that is not true about God. And it's not true about me, and it's not true about you either. That God and you are one, God and I are one, whatever that is for me in the moment at that time. And to the best of my abilities, to the best of my intentions, I live that greater good. And then that for me is the God of my understanding. So I can now say, well, there's no reason to beat myself up over this. Just because there is some inherited mythology or folklore that establishes a version of someone else's God that is something greater and mightier than what my conception of it is in the moment, is irrelevant to my expression and experience of God, to the growth in my consciousness, to my being more loving, more peaceful, more joyful, more compassionate. And once I recognize that about myself, then it makes it easy and almost essential for me to recognize that that is the truth of you, that is the truth of all beings everywhere, that within you and surrounding you is this ultimate reality, is this fantasticness, this wellspring of good, this force for good, and that everybody is doing their best to try to bring that into conscious awareness, to express it, to experience it, to circulate it, even even better than you have in this moment. The next moment, I intend to do better. The next moment, I intend to love more. The next moment, I intend to be more compassionate. And just to sustain that means that I am more loving, I am more peaceful, I am more compassionate. And that creates the world of my life and the lives that my life touches. Now, I want to point out that this discussion around God and the language that I use around God, or you use around God, or living spirit, or whatever your preferred term is, that's quite a bit different than faith. At least in the science of mind teaching, it's different than faith. So when one is having a discussion about God or living spirit or the ultimate reality or the infinite creative or whatever it is, I look at that as just refining and directing your consciousness, refining and directing the good that your life is, or is revealing or unfolding. Faith, on the other hand, in the science of mind, we say, well, faith is an activity of God, right? And so to question your faith is questioning how you're activating your good, right? Or if you're activating your good. And therefore, in science of mind, we say, well, you already have God within you. Therefore, you already have the full faith of God within you. And it's to the degree that your consciousness is expanding, that your consciousness is growing, that you are living more of that faith. So it's not kind of an off or on sort of thing. Faith is an ever evolving, ever growing, ever expanding activity of living spirit in your life and in my life. And therefore, it's a very different discussion. One is about sort of the nature of all that is versus how you're putting that all that is into motion, into activity in your life. Now, as I mentioned before, talking about living spirit, talking about God, that doesn't necessarily trigger consciousness. We'll put it like that. It doesn't automatically make me more an enlightened being. It is part of a process. But the thing that does expand consciousness are spiritual practices. Yes? And here are a list of some of the spiritual practices once I move beyond that slide. And so these are the things that you can do to expand your consciousness. These are things that you can do to put more of your faith into motion, into action. So meditation, spiritual mind treatment, affirmation and prayer, doing some form of spiritual study or reading. Journaling, if you set the intention, is a kind of spiritual practice. And of course, visioning being that sort of amalgamation of part meditation and part affirmation. And then giving yourself over to sacred service, seeing your practitioner, your spiritual counselor, giving as a spiritual practice, and participating as you are right now in the beloved community. And, Ernest Holmes says that that which is true and provable, and he was referring to the what we would in this case call the timeless wisdom, the inherited or received revelation of spiritual truth, that whole body, that which is true and provable may be discovered and put to practical use. And of course, that's what your spiritual practices are doing, right? You are discovering and putting into practice that which is your true essence, which is pure spirit. So your spiritual practices are sort of that, that converting, transforming a mechanism that you choose to engage in. And in so doing, almost magically, almost automatically, your consciousness grows. And as your consciousness grows, you live that higher life, that expanded life, that larger life. You become the more loving, more peaceful, more compassionate being that's already true about you. You express it, you experience it, you circulate it more freely and more frequently. So of those spiritual practices, what this week's theme, Grounded Beyond the Beginning, sort of focuses on are meditative and contemplative practices. Meaning, as one spends more time in meditation, this idea of living spirit, this idea of an infinite creative presence, this concept, this notion that has been evolved over the eons, that becomes truer to you, right? That grows the God of your understanding. And therefore, it's, you intend, and therefore you actually manifest and demonstrate. You put this force for good that's already true about you and surrounds you. You put more of that into your life and into the lives around you. Now, my walk of theology, of understanding or growing this idea of God and even healing my concept of God, and that's an ongoing process, right? At least it is for me. Mine came from a no God, meaning I was a card-carrying atheist up until I was probably in my 30s, right? And so just getting from a no God to something greater than myself didn't require a lot of unlearning someone else's idea of God, someone else's concept. And there are others that have an opposite experience of that. They have some concept of God, of living spirit, of this greater life, this larger life. And therefore coming to, as their consciousness expands and they're attracted to a teaching like ours that propels them on their spiritual journey, that they're concept of God then goes into sort of an evolutionary, an accelerated evolutionary process. We'll put it like that, right? And some of that evolutionary process is perhaps modifying or tweaking, or in some cases, just letting go of someone else's idea of God, someone else's idea of living spirit. And in its place then becomes, so I had nothing to replace. I was just filling in what just wasn't developed at all anyway. But then others are sort of in a sorting process. Yeah, this part of my concept of God is really working for me. This other part, not so much. I can probably let that go now. I can bless it and release it. And now in its place, yeah, I've got this other facet of God, of spirit, of consciousness that is really accelerating my growth, my love, my peace, my compassion, right? And it comes up onto this knowledge rubric, I would call it. You know, there is frequently this idea, well, what do you know? All right. Well, how do you know what you know? And then what don't you know? And of what you don't know, what can you know? And of what don't you know is unknowable, right? And therefore, on the spiritual journey, there are some metaphysical principles that I work with, that you work with, that create a knowing. And I'm talking about a knowing in the most expansive, the most plastic or flexible sense of the word. Not something that is, say, rigid or dogmatic, but something that uses provable spiritual principle that expands what you know. And therefore, it expands what you hold in thinking and consciousness. And as that expands, then what you gather in, you express, you experience, you circulate, that is good and positive and loving and productive and compassionate, all of that now starts to grow and expand along with an expansion of knowing. And it almost gets to the point of everything is knowable in the metaphysical sense. So the grounded beyond the beginning then is a kind of an interesting construct. So I want to share this this from Max Planck, who was one of the discoverers of atomic theory. And he says, we must assume behind this force that holds the atom together is the existence of a conscious and intelligent mind. This mind is the matrix of all. And of course, we're all very, very well steeped in this mythology that really comes from ancient African lore that eventually made it into a popular movie series called The Matrix, right? So we know that term, and we know its origins is from the beginning of humanity as a oral tradition through the African nations and people. But just think about this, that there is a conscious and intelligent mind. Now, in the world of quantum physics and quantum theory, there's this elusive thing called the Higgs boson, right? And bosons are things that tend to move from the wave of probability to the wave of actuality, and that this boson, this theory, this construct, is the thing that turns thinking into material things. And we do that metaphysically. So there is a parallel. Correlation is not causation. So I just want to be clear and distinct about that. But there is a way of thinking in quantum thinking that is exactly parallel to the way of metaphysics. Meaning, what I hold in consciousness most consistently becomes my reality. And therefore, to change my reality, I have to change what I hold in consciousness. So there is then this acceptance that what comes before me and what comes before you is an intelligence, right? There is some kind of an organizing principle, And it would be natural for me to assume, and maybe for you too, to assume that that organizing principle is a facet or an aspect of this living spirit, right? That there is something that converged, that came together, that organized a whole bunch of subatomic particles into atomic particles, into molecules, into cells and fibers and tissues and systems. And that became this expression of spirit known as Kevin, and became that expression of experience known as Bill or Julia or Dana or Brandy. All of that is part of a bigger organizing principle known as, for me, living spirit, God, an infinite creative, and intelligence. And of course, people say, okay, well, I get that something greater than myself came together to create me. Why did that happen? Well, that happened so that God could express more of itself, so that God could experience more of itself for all the best and positive reasons, so that there could be more of a circulation of all that is good, so there could be more of a connection that of all that is good, right? So that there can be more love and peace and joy in this plane of expression, so that there can be more health and well-being, so that there can be more compassion in this plane of experience. So that, and that just scratches the surface of the whys, right? And the great part on the science of my teaching is you get to fill in the why, right? So those are my ideas of why this organizing principle that is me is me. And there is also an organizing principle that is the chair I'm sitting in. And there is an organizing principle in the air that I am breathing, right? So all of that is just one small facet, one small part of an ongoing infinite intelligence, an ongoing creativity. And that ongoing creativity takes many forms, occurs in many phases, occurs at different frequencies, occurs in different amplitudes, right? And so the one that I am most familiar with is me and you in this worldly expression, in this worldly experience. But I have to begin to understand that there are expressions and experiences that are otherworldly, right? There are expressions and experiences, there are frequency, phases, and amplitudes of God, of living spirit, that extend way beyond the comprehension that I have right now, that extend way beyond the consciousness that I am living with right now. Now, my intention is to continue to grow my consciousness. My intention is to begin to continue to expand my consciousness, to really just participate in that greater expression, that greater experience. Yeah, I got a little taste of it. It's really good. Yes. How does it go, Reverend Judy? Yes.
It
Please
says,
thank.
yes, thank you, more, please.
Yes.
Yes,
Thank
thank
you.
you,
More,
more,
please.
please.
Yes. Thank you for that. So, so that's where this whole, discussion of, grounded beyond the beginning. I'm just accepting that I'm part of this pattern of which I may not comprehend, but I know it's good. And I know this by way of consciousness. I know this by way of feeling. And that is the most direct way that you and I get to experience the good that's already within us. When you feel good, that's God. When you feel love, that's God. When you feel peace, that's God. When you feel creative, that's God. When you feel compassion, that's God. And as you express it, the same thing. You are circulating God. And that's but one of the reasons that I think that I am here and you are here, to express an experience, to circulate more of that compassion, more of that love, more of that peace, more of that joy. And to be able to do that in different frequencies and phases and amplitudes, to be able to be that appropriate and healing presence wherever I go and wherever you go. So I would like just to hold that in mind right now as you think about the feeling that is God. And I'm going to share with you an affirmation, and then we're going to say a different affirmation. Well, maybe different for you, same for me. But here's an affirmation that I encourage you to work with this week, and says, I live life in full participation with the infinite. I live life in full participation with the infinite. And I hope that that language, I trust that that language resonates or works for you. If it doesn't, change it to language that does. But it does say, I'm in sync, I am cooperating, I'm collaborating with God, with living spirit, with something good, with something greater. And then this last piece, I want you to, if you want to, and I would keep your mics muted for this, just so that you can hear yourself saying these words. So your psyche, your consciousness likes most to hear you speak words of truth. In other words, your ears want to hear your voice speak words of truth to your consciousness. So that's why I'm encouraging you just to keep your mics muted and repeat this after me. So here we go. I am at home in the heart of God. My life is centered in truth. I live with a consciousness of peace. I am one with spirit and connected to all. I open to the vibrant faith within. I am living love. Well, and so it is. Thank you very, very much for joining in our conversation.
And so it is.